Tyrone Williams lay face down on the cold asphalt, his hands cuffed tightly behind his back. The faint metallic taste of blood filled his mouth as he blinked against the brightness of the streetlight overhead. Officer Edward Grayson stood above him, his face flushed with anger, his chest heaving. Tyrone's wallet lay open in the officer's trembling hands. This was the moment everything changed. For Officer Grayson, it was the night his unchecked arrogance collided with the truth. For Tyrone, it was another painful reminder that even success couldn't shield him from prejudice. Tyrone Williams was the kind of man anyone could look up to. At 32, he'd built a successful life, a thriving tech business, a growing presence in his community, and a quiet determination to make the world better for those coming after him. But Tyrone wasn't flashy. He didn't draw attention to himself. He didn't have to. His confidence came from within, and he carried it with quiet grace. Tyrone walks out of the gym into the cool night air, his hoodie pulled over his head to keep the chill off. The city around him is alive but subdued, the glow of the streetlights bouncing off shiny storefronts and empty sidewalks. He checks his phone, glancing at the time. It was late, but not too late. Just past 10 p.m. The streets were quiet, but not deserted. Tyrone texted his driver, Connor, letting him know he was ready. He leaned against a street lamp outside a luxury store, the faint hum of passing cars filling the silence. The breeze tugged at his hoodie as he scrolled through his phone, waiting. The minutes stretched. Tyrone glanced at his phone again, checking the time. 10 minutes had passed. He texted Connor once more, a brief message to make sure everything was okay. Tyrone wasn't in a rush. Connor was usually reliable, and Tyrone understood that delays happened. He didn't mind waiting. The stillness of the night gave him a chance to think, to breathe. It was one of the rare moments in his day when he could pause and enjoy the quiet. But then, something shifted. He felt it before he saw it. A subtle shift in the air, a sense of being watched. Across the street, a man in a police uniform stepped out of his patrol car, Officer Edward Grayson. Officer Edward Grayson was a man molded by years on the force, a middle-aged veteran who prided himself on being able to read people. But his instincts were often colored by something he refused to admit to himself: bias. As he watched Tyrone from across the street, his thoughts turned darker, his assumptions sharper. Grayson muttered under his breath as he pushed himself off the car, his boots hitting the pavement with purpose. His eyes locked onto Tyrone, who stood across the street, leaning casually against the lamppost. There was no reason for alarm. Tyrone was just waiting. But to Grayson, it was enough. He narrowed his eyes, his mind already forming assumptions. "Another one of these guys," Grayson muttered, the words low and laced with contempt. Standing around like he owns the place. It didn't matter to him who Tyrone was or why he was there. It didn't even matter that Tyrone wasn't breaking any laws. In Grayson's mind, Tyrone didn't belong. Not in this part of town, not at this time of night, and certainly not in front of a store that sold things Grayson himself couldn't afford on his salary. He crossed the street, his hand resting on his belt, his posture stiff and deliberate. He stopped just a few feet from Tyrone, his voice cutting through the quiet night like a blade. "What are you doing here?" Grayson snapped, his tone accusatory. "Loitering?" Tyrone turned slowly, his movements calm and deliberate. He knew better than to react suddenly. He kept his body language open, his hands visible, his expression neutral. "No, sir," Tyrone said, his voice steady and polite. "I'm just waiting for my assistant to pick me up." Grayson scanned him from head to toe, his lips curling into a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. "Your assistant, right?" He let the words linger, thick with doubt. Then he tilted his head toward the store behind Tyrone. "Do you even know where you are? This isn't your kind of neighborhood." Tyrone tilted his head slightly, meeting Grayson's gaze without wavering. He kept his tone calm, measured, refusing to let the hostility seep under his skin. "Sir," Tyrone said, his words deliberate, "I don't want any trouble. I'm just standing here." But Grayson wasn't interested in answers. He wasn't asking questions. He was making accusations. Tyrone could feel the tension radiating off him, thick and suffocating. Grayson took a step closer, closing the already small distance between them. His presence was heavy, his body language meant to intimidate. Tyrone held his ground, though his heart beat faster in his chest. He could feel the officer's eyes on him, searching, scanning, looking for something, anything, to justify the suspicion that was already brewing in his mind. "You've got a lot of nerve," Grayson said, his voice dripping with disdain. "Standing here like you belong. Why don't you move along before I give you a reason to?" Tyrone exhaled slowly, careful to keep his emotions in check. He kept his eyes level, his hands visible, his voice firm but non-confrontational. "I'm just waiting, officer," he said evenly. "I haven't done anything wrong." Grayson's jaw tightened, and he gestured toward the baton at his side. His fingers brushed the handle, a subtle but clear warning. "You people think you can do whatever you want," he said, his tone rising. "Not tonight." The words cut deeper than the officer likely realized, or cared to admit. Tyrone had heard those words before, in different places from different faces, but the meaning was always the same: you don't belong. Tyrone took another slow breath, forcing himself to remain calm. He didn't want to give Grayson an excuse to escalate the situation, but he could tell the officer wasn't looking for an excuse. He was looking for control. The tension in the air pulled Tyrone's mind into memories he'd tried to bury. He remembered being a teenager, walking into a convenience store with his friends, feeling the clerk's eyes follow him like a shadow. He remembered the sharp edge in her voice when she said, "Can I help you?" Her words anything but welcoming. That memory faded, replaced by another. He was in his 20s, sitting in a coffee shop, working on his laptop, when he overheard a man at the next table whispering to his companion. "You think he's dealing drugs or something?" the man had said, his voice loud enough for Tyrone to hear. These moments weren't rare. They weren't even surprising anymore. They were the quiet undercurrent of Tyrone's life, reminders that no matter how much he achieved, there would always be those who saw him as a threat. Grayson stepped even closer, his movements slow and deliberate, as if savoring the tension he was creating. His tone grew sharper, each word cutting like a blade. The baton at his side seemed to catch the light, glinting ominously under the street lamp. "You think you're smarter than me?" he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "Standing there like you've got nothing to hide, why don't you empty your pockets? Let's see what you're carrying." Tyrone hesitated, just for a moment. It wasn't because he had anything to hide, he didn't, but because he could feel the trap Grayson was setting. He knew this dance, had seen it play out before, and every instinct told him that the officer wasn't looking for answers, he was looking for control. Slowly, deliberately, Tyrone raised his hands, palms up, a universal gesture of compliance. "I'm not carrying anything, officer," Tyrone said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm just waiting here, like I said." Grayson's smirk twisted into something uglier, a sneer that radiated contempt. He stepped even closer, so close that Tyrone could feel the officer's breath, hot and acrid, as the tension between them thickened. "Don't play games with me," Grayson growled, his words low and deliberate. "I know you're kind, always looking for trouble, always thinking you're above the law." The words landed like blows, not just insults but provocations. They were designed to strip away Tyrone's dignity, to push him to the edge where anger or fear might betray him. But Tyrone didn't take the bait. He stood his ground, his body still, his heart pounding in his chest like a drumbeat, steady and unyielding. The world around them felt impossibly small in that moment. The empty street, the faint hum of distant traffic, none of it seemed to exist anymore. There was only this, a man trying to simply exist, and another man determined to erase that existence. Tyrone's voice broke the silence, cutting through the suffocating stillness with a steadiness he wasn't sure he still possessed. "Officer, I don't want any trouble," he said, his tone unwavering. "I've told you the truth. My assistant is on his way. If you'll just wait a few minutes, he'll be here." Grayson didn't respond immediately. He stared at Tyrone, his jaw tight, his hands still resting on the baton as if weighing the power of his next move. The air between them seemed to crackle, heavy with unspoken tension. But the truth was clear. Grayson wasn't interested in Tyrone's words. He wasn't interested in waiting. What he wanted wasn't justice or even order. It was power. The kind of power that comes from fear, from submission, from knowing he could act however he pleased and face no real consequences. In that moment, Tyrone knew what he was up against. He could feel it in every word, every movement, every unspoken threat that lingered in the officer's gaze. But even in the face of that looming storm, Tyrone held on to his resolve, refusing to let fear take over, refusing to give Grayson what he wanted. The tension in the air was unbearable now, thick like a storm cloud ready to burst. Grayson's hand gripped the baton at his side so tightly that his knuckles whitened, his body practically vibrating with frustration. He took another step forward, his voice cutting through the night like a blade. "You think you can just talk your way out of this?" he spat, his tone venomous. "I've had enough of your attitude." Tyrone didn't move. He didn't flinch. His breathing remained controlled, but inside his heart raced. He knew this wasn't about words anymore. This was about power, about dominance. And then Grayson snapped. Without warning, he raised his fist and drove it into Tyrone's face. The force of the punch sent Tyrone stumbling backward, his head snapping to the side. He barely had time to recover before Grayson lunged forward, grabbing him by the arm and slamming him to the ground. The asphalt was cold and unforgiving against Tyrone's back. He felt the weight of the officer's knee pressing into his spine as the metallic clink of handcuffs echoed in his ears. The world narrowed in that moment. The streetlights blurred into halos above him, and the sound of Grayson's harsh breathing drowned out everything else. Tyrone's mind raced, but his body stayed still. He had to stay calm. He had to survive. Tyrone's internal dialogue became his anchor, the words repeating like a mantra. "Stay calm. Don't fight back. Don't give him an excuse to hurt you more." Grayson's voice cut through his thoughts, sharp and cruel. "You think you're better than me? You think you can just stand here like you own the place?" But Tyrone didn't respond. He stared up at the sky, the weight of Grayson's knee a brutal reminder of how quickly things could spiral out of control. Grayson stood, looming over Tyrone as if he'd won some unspoken battle. He reached for Tyrone's wallet, pulling it out with a smirk that screamed triumph. "Let's see who you really are," Grayson sneered, flipping open the wallet with one hand. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. The smirk on Grayson's face faltered, replaced by confusion, then disbelief. His eyes scanned the ID again, as if hoping the name would change if he just looked hard enough. And there it was, in bold letters that couldn't be ignored. Tyrone Williams, son of Chief Harold Williams. The shift in Grayson's demeanor was almost comical, his confidence evaporating like mist under the morning sun. His mouth opened, then closed, his words tripping over each other as he tried to recover. I didn't know," he stammered, his voice suddenly small, almost trembling. Tyrone turned his head slowly, meeting Grayson's eyes with a calmness that belied the storm raging within him. Tyrone pushed himself into a sitting position, his gaze locked on Grayson. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low and steady, each word cutting deeper than any punch could. "You didn't know," Tyrone said quietly, his tone almost conversational. "And that's supposed to make this okay? This badge doesn't give you the right to abuse anyone. It doesn't matter who I am, or who my father is. I'm not the first, am I? How many others have you done this to?" Grayson tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He fumbled for an explanation, but there was none that could justify his actions. The power dynamic had shifted, and Grayson knew it. The silence between them was deafening. For the first time that night, Grayson wasn't in control. He wasn't the one asking questions, and he wasn't the one with the upper hand. The truth had stripped him bare, exposing the ugliness of his actions for what they truly were. The tension of the moment lingered, heavy and unrelenting, as Tyrone's words hung in the air. "I'm going to make sure my father hears about this," he said, his tone unwavering. "And I'm going to make sure everyone else does too." This wasn't just about Tyrone anymore. This was about accountability, about justice, about breaking a cycle that had gone unchecked for far too long. And in that moment, Tyrone knew he wasn't just standing up for himself. He was standing up for everyone who had been silenced before him. The sharp headlights of a sleek black sedan pierced through the quiet night, illuminating the scene. The car came to a screeching halt a few feet away, and Connor, Tyrone's assistant, practically leapt out, slamming the door behind him. His tailored suit and polished shoes seemed almost out of place against the gritty backdrop of the confrontation. Connor froze for a moment, his wide eyes taking in the sight before him. Tyrone, bruised and handcuffed on the ground, his usually composed boss reduced to a figure of quiet resilience under the weight of injustice. His face flushed with a mix of outrage and disbelief as he stormed toward them. "What the hell happened here?" Connor's voice cut through the tension, loud and demanding, his privilege emboldening him to speak in a way Tyrone never could in this situation. He turned to Grayson, his expression a mix of fury and incredulity. "Do you even know who this man is?" Grayson's face, already pale from the shock of Tyrone's identity, flushed with embarrassment. He stammered, searching for words, but Connor didn't wait for a response. "This is Tyrone Williams," Connor continued, his voice rising, "CEO of Titan Tech, a man who's built more in a decade than you could in a lifetime. And oh, by the way, he's the son of Chief Harold Williams." Tyrone, still sitting on the ground, his composure unbroken, glanced up at Connor with a calm that was both commanding and reassuring. "Connor," he said softly, his tone firm but measured, "that's enough. Help me up." Connor hesitated, his anger still simmering, but he nodded and moved to assist Tyrone. He unlocked the handcuffs with Grayson's reluctant help, and together they helped Tyrone to his feet. While Connor's outrage filled the air, Tyrone's calm remained unshaken. He knew that the weight of this moment wasn't about the anger or the humiliation. It was about the next step, about ensuring that this didn't end here. The quiet hum of the station filled the air as Tyrone walked through its doors. His steps were steady, his gaze fixed ahead, each movement deliberate. Connor followed closely behind, still fuming, but Tyrone didn't look back. He reached his father's office and knocked once before stepping inside. Chief Harold Williams looked up from his desk, his sharp eyes narrowing as they landed on his son. He stood immediately, his presence commanding, his years of experience in law enforcement evident in the way he carried himself. "What happened?" Chief Williams asked, his voice low but laced with urgency. Tyrone began to recount the night's events, his tone calm and even, each word carefully chosen. He didn't embellish, didn't dramatize. He didn't need to. The truth was damning enough. As Tyrone spoke, his father's expression shifted, from concern to anger to something colder, more resolute. When Tyrone finished, Chief Williams leaned back in his chair, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. "This stops now," the chief said, his voice steady but filled with quiet fury. "Not just for you, but for everyone who's been through this. We're gonna handle this, Tyrone. I promise you that." Chief Williams wasn't just a father in that moment. He was a man who had seen too much, tolerated too much, and was now faced with the consequences of a system he was sworn to uphold. For him, this was personal. For Tyrone, it was a chance to begin a larger fight. The days that followed were a blur of paperwork, testimonies, and closed-door meetings. An internal investigation was launched, and Grayson's file was pulled. What they found wasn't surprising to Tyrone, but it was damning. Complaints of excessive force, reports of profiling, incidents swept under the rug, ignored, or excused under the guise of doing the job. Grayson's history painted a clear picture of a man who had operated without accountability for far too long. Flashbacks showed other victims: an elderly black man dragged from his car over a broken taillight, a young woman pushed to the ground outside a convenience store, a teenager detained for matching a description. Each face carried the weight of injustice, each story a thread in the fabric of systemic failure. This wasn't just about Grayson. It was about a culture that allowed him to thrive, that enabled his behavior, that silenced those who tried to speak out. And now, for the first time, that culture was being forced to reckon with itself. It didn't take long for the story to leak. A journalist caught wind of the investigation, and soon, the headlines were everywhere. Tyrone, ever composed, used his platform to amplify the message. He gave interviews, not about his personal pain, but about the need for change. "This isn't just about me," he said during one broadcast. "It's about accountability. It's about a system that needs to be better for everyone." The story ignited a firestorm. Social media lit up with hashtags, protests were organized, and the conversation spread beyond Tyrone's city to the nation at large. What had started as a quiet night outside a luxury store had become a rallying cry for justice. Across the city, and soon across the country, people took to the streets. Protesters held signs that read "Justice for All," "End Police Brutality," and "We Stand with Tyrone." Candlelight vigils were held, discussions were sparked in schools and workplaces, and debates raged in city council meetings. Change doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens when people stand together, when voices rise in unison, when silence is no longer an option. Tyrone's story was a spark, but the fire it lit was carried by those who refused to let it burn out. Tyrone attended one of the protests, standing among the crowd as chants echoed through the streets. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence was enough, a symbol of resilience, of accountability, of the possibility for change. And in that moment, Tyrone saw something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Not just for himself, but for the world he was helping to reshape. The investigation reached its inevitable conclusion. Grayson, the officer who had once wielded his authority like a weapon, was dismissed from the force. The decision came with a terse statement from the department, citing gross misconduct and failure to adhere to professional standards. But to Tyrone, and to many others, it wasn't enough. Grayson's dismissal wasn't the victory it might have seemed. For those who had watched his abuses go unchecked for years, it felt more like the closing of one chapter than the beginning of another. Because this wasn't about one man, it was about a culture, a system, and a history that allowed men like Grayson to thrive in the first place. Grayson himself disappeared from the public eye, his name dragged through headlines and hashtags, but the damage he had done, the lives he had touched with his malice, remained. And for Tyrone, this was the moment to shift the conversation. The auditorium was packed, rows of chairs filled with faces of every age, every race, every background. Tyrone stood at the podium, his presence commanding yet humble. He looked out at the crowd, at the cameras broadcasting his words to countless others, and took a deep breath. "This isn't about one bad cop," Tyrone began, his voice steady and clear. "It's about a broken system, a system that allows prejudice to masquerade as protection, that lets fear dictate actions instead of justice. But let me be clear, we're not here to destroy it, we're here to rebuild it." The room was silent, every ear hanging on Tyrone's words. He didn't speak with anger or resentment. He spoke with purpose, with the kind of conviction that only comes from lived experience. "We can't pretend this is someone else's problem," Tyrone continued. "We can't wait for someone else to fix it. This starts with all of us, with the choices we make, the conversations we have, the actions we take every single day." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the room. "I'm not here because of what happened to me. I'm here because of what happens every day, to people without a platform, without a voice, without someone to believe them. We owe it to them to do better." The crowd erupted into applause, but Tyrone raised a hand to quiet them. "This isn't the end," he said, his voice firm. "This is just the beginning. The real work starts now." As Tyrone stepped down from the podium, the crowd rose to its feet in a standing ovation. But he wasn't looking for applause. He was looking for change. Tyrone's story had become a spark, igniting conversations and movements far beyond the city where it all began. But he knew that awareness was only the first step. The real challenge was action, and he wasn't afraid to ask for it. The camera lingers on Tyrone as he speaks to a smaller group of community leaders, outlining plans for police reform, advocating for mandatory bias training, and pushing for independent oversight committees. His determination is palpable, his energy infectious. But this wasn't just about policies. It was about people, about challenging assumptions, breaking down barriers, and rebuilding trust in a system that had lost it long ago. Tyrone's message wasn't just for lawmakers or officers. It was for everyone. Thank you for watching this story. If you found it impactful or meaningful, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Sharing this video could help spark an important conversation, so don't hesitate to hit that share button, and we'd love to hear from you.